What makes a home? And what gives one the right to call any place they post a flag a home? Moreover, what if that place has no interest in being called anything, or agree with human standards of reality? Jane and her family find the answers to these questions the hard way, in a gruesome resolution that reminds humanity that we haven't figured it all out. Chapter 1: The Second Sun. 20 years since we left Earth for Nea Gaia, a rocky world orbiting a single star in the farthest reaches of the Milky Way that we could only just get to with our limited technology. That was almost a decade spent on board the Ark II, and also happened to be the first half of my entire existence. I wasn't born on the ship, but just a month or so prior to its setting course for the single planet in the galaxy eligible for human habitation. It was also the farthest that we could run to escape. 10 years it has been since we got here and started building the homestead, nurturing it slowly and patiently, as Jack and Jill were growing up strong, contrary to what was originally expected. Many had been worried that all the children born on the Arks, like the twins, wouldn't survive even a year on the planet, let alone one the size of Nea Gaia. It was dreaded that many Earthborn, but raised from infancy on the vessel, would perish too. Yet, all of us survived. 1 year has passed since Junior was born as a healthy child, proper Gaian, a human extraterrestrial. Mother was happy to welcome him into the family, even though she was crushed that she had to raise him in this desolate place. That was humanity's last chance of survival. No one knew that Nea Gaia was almost a barren planet. Its landscape was mostly rock and shrubbery, a desert with barely any water and little to no wildlife. The primary Ark might have been sent to terraform much earlier than we were set to even start from Earth. But what happened to them? Then, shortly after us, you were expected to arrive. The last Ark of 3, the Builders. We were excited about all the new things you would bring. You were the finishing touch that this planet needed. You were the last of Earth, and also the saving grace of Nea Gaia. We were happy to welcome you to our new home.
Jane!
Mother called after me from the far side of the homestead, near the rocky hillside.
Come quick, the cows are going to cross over to the Miltons if we don't stop them.
She'd been taking care of the cattle while Father and I were trying to fix the water filtration system. It needed some work done if we were ever to connect it to the more complex water supply network we expected you would build. Coming, Mom! Dad?
Go help your mother.
He smiled at me.
I can manage from here. It won't be done today anyway.
I ran past the barn where Jack and Jill were keeping Junior occupied. They were dancing circles around him, showing him the strange rocks they found, or chasing away the small lizard-like creatures that would creep closer to him on the ground. They were happy, laughing and playing, used to the planet that was the only home they ever knew.
They keep trying to get inside the small caverns all around the base of the hill.
I laughed when Mother told me what the cows were doing as I approached. How can they ever expect to fit? Those are no bigger than Junior.
I don't know, Jane.
Mother was not amused.
They're acting a bit strange today. I simply don't know what's gone into them.
She clicked her tongue and motioned for me to go over and chase them from the other side.
It's like something has spooked them. But I see no sign of the Milton's dogs anywhere, nor any other of their animals.
The two of us managed to get the cattle back in the pen, and Mother went over to the kids to get them ready for supper, since nightfall was soon, and she didn't want them playing close to the barn when it was dark. Father had already stopped working and was getting his tools together, so I ran over to the generator to get it started. It was already running on fumes, so we would only turn it on during the night. That would be the last time that we would use it for the lights. The following week passed slowly, and with a sudden and undeniable air of gloom. I busied myself with the basic electric grid, adding the necessary bits that would allow us to detach it from the generator and connect to the expanded grid when you arrived. Mother tended to the animals and Junior, fussing mostly around the artificial food the cattle ate that was running dangerously low as well. And Father was really worried about the water filtration units. Needless to say that you were greatly expected for several reasons. The necessity of industry had become unavoidable, since Nea Gaia wasn't what we thought it would be. Among all of that, something else happened during that week that eventually got us to the way we are now. We were all too busy running the homestead and getting ready for your arrival to really have noticed it. One day, a single sun became 2, and we were none the wiser as to how it happened. Did the second sun rise from behind the bleak horizon? Or did it simply appear out of nothing on the sky of Nea Gaia, never noticed previously, yet never setting? Maybe it was always there, shining, yellow, burning, watching. Junior was particularly enamored by it. Nothing else could stop his crying in the middle of the night. We would go outside on the porch, and I'd sit myself down on the rocking chair with Junior on my lap. He would instantly smile upon looking up at the sky. Not just that, though. He was always cooing at it, raising his tiny fingers at it, and giggling and laughing. Honestly, the only way to describe what was going on was to say that he was talking to it, or communicating with it in some special language only the two of them spoke. But how can a star speak? The second sun, how could it speak? Chapter 2. The Turning.
Morning, neighbors. I see you're busy with the preparations.
Dan Milton came over to the homestead one day to check on us. He had the habit of doing that since he loved us very much. Not many people around these parts. The other homesteads were mostly centered across the single high-peaked mountain that pierced our horizon, just past the low hillside. Father didn't want to build where the rest were. I think he found the remains of the primary arc disturbing because of how they were left. Nice to see you, Dan.
Losing our minds, more like it.
Father commented cynically.
All will be all right in the end.
Dan always had a positive air around him, unlike Father.
I don't know about that, neighbor. A lot can go wrong in a month.
John, Jane is right there.
Mother intervened.
Maybe it's time she finds out, Joy. Maybe I should take her over the mountain to the first arc.
That's enough of that. Tensions are running high from expectation, Joy. Don't hold that against your husband. I'm sure you will tell the kids when the time is right. John?
That thing in the sky isn't a sign that we should tell them now, Dan?
Father was getting more agitated.
Have you told your kids?
The purple orb? Nah. I'm sure that was always there.
Was it?
Mother asked and looked up at the sky, squinting and perplexed.
Purple orb? That's a second sun right there, Dan. And it's clearly of a bluish tinge. What kind of crazy talk are you trying to bring to my house?
Dan mumbled something to Father in response, which I could not understand, but it upset him even more. The two of them got into a screaming match, of which I could barely catch anything more than it involved the primary arc that arrived on Nea Gaia. All I could tell was that whatever the problem they were discussing was important, heavy, complicated. Whatever stance Dan held and couldn't be persuaded against prompted Father to eventually drive the men right out of the house. In answer to Mother's pleas to stop arguing and calm their tempers, Dan had only one more thing to say.
I'll come back in 3 days, neighbor. That should give you ample time to cool off. And if you still insist on calling me crazy, you will have lost a friend. Think about that, John. Out here, there's not many you can choose from.
There'll be plenty when the third arc arrives.
Don't count on that. Aiding with supplies is one thing, but they'll be busy elsewhere on the planet. You and I are not meant to mingle with that crowd. Those cities won't be for us. We need to fix our own problems and do it now.
Stop it, both of you. You don't know what the builders would be like.
Mother feared that I didn't already guess what my future here would be like, but I'd already heard her and Father talking about that years before.
3 days, Joy. Knock some sense into him.
Dan told Mother and walked away, but father was ready to run out after him.
Oh, I'll knock some sense into you.
John!
I hurried down to the porch and saw Mother quietly speaking to father as Dan was moving away into the desolate distance and slowly disappearing behind the rocky hillside. Thankfully, she had stopped father from doing anything he'd later regret. The sun was already down, but the yellow orb burned the sky with such power, I would have thought it was midday. Junior was screaming from his crib, letting me know it was time for his midnight heart-to-heart with his celestial friend. He had a lot to coo about that night. The following day, I had woken up to find Mother sitting in the kitchen and looking outside through the window that overlooked the gray desert surrounding our homestead. The barn was just to the left of the house, and on the right was the hillside that created the natural border between us and the Miltons' farm. In the distance, if you followed the hill to the right, you would see the mountain that halved the horizon. So desolate. Dead. Not something any of us loved seeing. I can't describe Mother's expression at that moment perfectly, but I would say it appeared as if she was struggling with confusion and worry simultaneously. Her harsh brow was furrowed, and her lips were tensed tightly over her teeth, crooked to one side. "Mom?"
Look at that, Jane.
She motioned toward the spherical window with her head, without taking her eyes off of what she was seeing beyond it. I stepped closer and peeked out, instantly dropping the glass of water I was holding. I could barely even hold on to myself.
If my eyes don't mistake me, the cows have completely changed.
Mother continued in a flat but ominous tone. "Twisted," I whispered, staring at our land where all of the animals had gathered, standing motionless in the middle of the farm. They looked something awful.
When I saw all of them there, I couldn't believe it. All twisted into knots like that. Then I kept wondering, was this actually how they'd always been? How then would I be able to milk them? Was the milk ever any good?
"It's terrible." The words left my lips before I could think more deeply about them.
It sure is something.
Mother said, and looked at me as if she was experiencing the shock of this new development all over again through me. Junior had started murmuring, and I realized I hadn't even noticed he was seated on his small stool next to Mother. She turned to smile at him, like she was the sole human that could fully understand his little thoughts. The sweetness that took over her face was in stark contrast to what she looked like seconds prior. "What? What is he saying, Mom?" I asked, curious beyond measure. Part of me was so mystified by this little child and his growing strangeness that I could hardly put it into words.
Oh, nothing that the twins haven't already told me before. Jack was actually telling me just the other day that the animals had always looked like this to him. And you know Jill, she'll always confirm what her brother says.
Junior cooed again and interrupted Mother. I looked at him again, and for a fleeting moment, I could swear that he himself was as twisted up and wretched as those damned cows. "Mother!" I yelped, but when she turned and gave me a better look at him, curled up in her arms, he looked normal.
What's wrong?
She asked. I shook my head. Junior cooed at me and giggled, and Mother laughed. "What are we going to do, Mom?"
What we always do, Jane. Tend to the cattle and see that it provides us with what we need.
Mother answered, and not a moment too soon, the twins had joined us, instantly smooshing their faces to the window and gazing out into the farm. They were happy like always, as if they had noticed nothing wrong, nothing out of the ordinary. I was worried, scared, and Mother, I didn't know what she felt anymore. I don't think she did either. Everything changed in the blink of an eye. All of it. But it was as if I was the only one that remained affected by it somehow. Aware of it, and feeling its consequences. Father had become very distant since the day he argued with Dan Milton, spending all of his time in the barn and talking solely to the twins. He had become obsessed with something new and foreign. Later, I would find out that there was really nothing of note there. It was he that had become the problem. We all kept secrets from each other. We all spoke in different languages, belonging to the small groups that had formed within the family. However, the next night, I could finally understand what Junior was saying. We clicked. We were finally functioning on the same wavelength. Rocking back and forth on the porch as he was extending his tiny arms towards the bright sky at midnight, his coos became words to me. "What do you mean, red?" I asked him, and he mumbled back, "It's clearly yellow, Junior." But he wouldn't have it. The little creature was absolutely convinced that the second sun was as bright red as our barn, made from the scraps of the ship in which we came here. Perplexing, truly, since Mother had mentioned that to her the second sun was actually a pure white color that scorched through her eyelids and made her lose sleep for the last couple of weeks. Chapter 3. The Wailing. 3 days had passed since Dan Milton was last on our homestead, and he returned just as he said he would. Mother and I were outside tending to the cattle when we saw him walking up and over the rocky hills. I glanced at Mother, and she nodded.
Go close the barn door, Jane. I think your father still doesn't want to see him.
Joy!
Dan yelled when he noticed Mother, waving and smiling. Mother ran a little to catch up with him midway, and they started chatting without me. I was just closing the barn door and peeked inside to see if Father had heard him. He was crouched over and fully immersed in whatever he was doing in there. However, Dan's voice echoed again, this time catching Father's attention. He turned around and gave me a sharp look that froze my blood. He stood up, towering over everything that was in the barn, suddenly twice as tall as I thought he actually was. Before he could take a step, let alone reach the door, I slammed it and locked it behind me. Father shook the door trying to open it, grunting and growling, but thankfully, Dan hadn't heard him. In the instance that I turned around to see where Dan and Mother were standing, I heard a terrible scream, and Mother was running away to the house, crying, "Mom! Mom!"
What's wrong with Joy?
Dan asked me out of breath for trying to reach me.
I mentioned the little ones and she just lost it. She babbled something about the white light not letting us sleep and nightmares and about horrible looking cattle, but never answered any of my questions.
I wanted to run after Mother because I didn't understand what Dan was talking about, but he grabbed my arm and asked me the strangest thing.
Where are your brothers and sisters, Jane? Has something happened to the kids?
The kids, Dan?
Your siblings, Jane.
I stared at him, in his weirdly confused face. I never had any siblings. Did I? It was always just the three of us. Mother, Father, and I. Dan must have been outside in the heat for too long, because his reasoning sounded very impaired. Or was it mine? No, not me. I noticed the changes, all of them. If I had siblings and they went missing, I would have noticed.
Will you please tell me what's going on here?
Dan insisted.
I really wanted to speak to your father. I don't like the way we left things, and if there's anything else that's happened here, I want to help.
Nothing has happened, I blurted out. I wanted him to leave.
Jane, I might really be losing my mind, but I was convinced that you had siblings. And your mother's reaction.
The second son is making her sad. That's all.
I won't lie to you, Jane. Something is strange on my farm as well. Me and my wife keep on forgetting things. Some time ago, 3 days maybe, or was it yesterday? We noticed changes in our animals. They were just odd looking, like they weren't supposed to be that way. Made no sense. Twisted and disfigured in ways I'd never seen living things to be.
Dan paused. He thought deeply about what he was saying. I could see it on his face. Our cows look that way, Dan. That's normal, isn't it?
Is it?
A small light flickered in his eyes, like I confirmed that he wasn't going insane.
I can't remember. I thought John might remember. Or Joy.
He looked up. A little calf was staggering towards us. By the way its feet were positioned on its body, I wouldn't have believed it could even stand, much less walk. Its torso was twisting around on its own axis, and all of its limbs were wrapped around it, until they came out of each end, barely touching the ground. I said staggering, but it was almost pushing itself along on its belly. It mooed and cried, and eventually stopped moving a few steps from me and Dan.
Yes. It's the same with my sheep. If your cows look like this as well, it must be normal then. You're right, Jane. I just don't know what got into me.
Dan left feeling relieved, promising again to come back in a few days. But I was left wondering, have things always been this way? I looked down, and the calf was looking up at me. It mooed again. Don't worry, little friend. Everything will be alright. However, I suddenly felt incredible dread and disgust come over me as I was watching this pitiful creature struggle with life itself. Something did look wrong about it. Whatever it was, I had no clue, but it became simply unrecognizable to me as anything I'd seen previously, twisted and knotted up onto itself, like the most gruesome ball of fleshy yarn. Nature doesn't work like this. What was this creature looking up at me with? Its bloodied eyes? My chest felt tight, and there was a piercing ache in my stomach. I glanced at the sky to check if nightfall was close, and felt like the second sun was looking down at me, with the same dread and disgust I felt for the calf. Dan must have really gotten inside my head. No wonder Father had driven him out a few days ago. How can a star look down on me? How can it feel anything? I tried putting these strange thoughts and feelings behind me and went to sit on the porch in my rocking chair, like I did every night. It could have been a particularly calm and silent night if it wasn't for Mother's wails inside the house. I tried listening to what she was trying to say, but I couldn't understand the meaning. Before I stood to go to try and calm her down, I had the same feeling of inexplicable dread. Something was missing. Again, I looked up at the second sun. What was missing from this moment?
Jane!
Mother sobbed out for me. I jumped on my feet, but instead of running into the house, I ran off toward the hillside. I couldn't bear facing her. There was something telling me that her voice didn't sound quite right, that her movement inside on the plastic floors was crooked and off. I didn't want to see her and feel the same as I had when I looked at the calf. What was wrong and what was right? Was I? I ran and I ran on the hillside, knowing that I was looking for something there. A cave, big enough to fit me. The missing thing that always made me sit on the front porch in my rocking chair. A missing part of the puzzle that kept changing. A different view of the sky to make sure the second sun wasn't looking down at me. In the morning, when the two suns were shining again in the sky, I finally collapsed on the rocks, tired and hurting all over, my feet bleeding and my stomach churning. I didn't know what to do. Should I go to the Milton homestead? I could see it from where I was laying, barely visible, but it was there. I wish I hadn't looked. Twisted sheep and wretched wails echoed as far as the hill. Was it Dan or his wife wailing? Where were their children? Out of the blue, a small voice called out to me from under the rocks, and I thought I was dreaming. Some kind of instinct made me dig and burrow deep inside the hill, until I finally reached a hollow space. It was a cave, just big enough for me to crawl into. Arms stretched out in front, grabbing for the walls of the cave, I shimmied my entire body inside. And then, after a moment or so, the yellow haze disappeared, and there was something completely uncanny in the cave. Something I almost forgot existed. Darkness. My eyes were wide open, but they felt relieved, as if they were finally resting. I hadn't realized the strain I had been putting on them, and the intensity with which the yellow light was burning through them. The little voice called out again. I knew that voice. I loved that voice. I had crawled into its den, and was now completely under its strange protection. Junior? I whispered, and it cooed back. I missed you too, little one. Chapter 4. The Cosmic Eye. A few days later, I crawled out of the cave and made my way back to the homestead. Alone. After everything that I had been through, witnessed, and felt, it was time to face what I escaped. Walking on top of the hillside gave me a better look at both homesteads, ours and the Miltons, at the mountain in the distance, but also the sky. It was clear now, clear as it ever was before. The second sun was staring down at me, watching me, and measuring my every step. It was like a giant eye in the sky that might have always been there, eons before we were ever even living. Or it might have appeared out of nothing, from spaces unknown and unreachable. That's how its gaze felt upon me. When I eventually reached the homestead, it looked empty and unlived. The cows were all dead or dying in the pen, just as twisted and repulsive as I remember them becoming.
Jane?
Father's voice came from the barn. It was raspy and odd.
Is that you, darling? Where have you been?
As I stepped toward the barn, he was coming out of it, barely squeezing through the door, barely standing, barely moving from his own weight. It took me a moment to realize, to really see what he had turned into. On top of a twisted torso, 2 more bodies were attached. 2 more heads on his shoulders, with pairs of eyes that looked familiar to me.
The twins missed you, Jane. They said you ran away from home.
Jack and Jill were completely fused to Father's body, as if he'd consumed them and made them a part of who he was. The 3 of them were, at that point, a single being. 1 mouth speaking, 3 mouths moving, 1 giant leg stepping forward, 2 more kicking in the air. Dad? I gulped. Where's Mother?
Jane!
Suddenly, I heard my name being wailed from somewhere behind me. I turned and expected Mother to come running or staggering toward me. But it was Dan.
Neva.
Father growled at him.
You said 3 days, and it has been...
Run, Jane, run and hide. Go to the hill, the mountain, wherever you can. Save yourself.
Dan finally reached me. He didn't look right either, but I was so overwhelmed at this point that I couldn't tell what it was that had happened to him.
Don't run, Jane. Stay. This is home.
Go back into the barn, John.
Dan said.
No,
Father whined like a little child.
I don't want to.
Was it him speaking? Or was it little Jack? Or Jill? I couldn't start running. My legs wouldn't let me. Besides, I wanted to see. I wanted to understand what I knew in my heart that I couldn't. Two massive beasts pushing each other, one overtaking the other, then pleading with him.
Go back, John.
I heard Dan repeat. I heard him command the towering beast with 6 arms, 6 legs, 6 eyes, and 3 heads. There was a quiet moo just next to me. I turned and realized I was standing next to the pen. The little calf was still alive. It must have yelped because it got frightened and began to shiver. We brought him here. This thing. This creature. This earthling. We dragged its kind to the other side of the galaxy without even asking, only for it to be turned and twisted by something completely inexplicable. We didn't bring it or its kin here to save them, but to feed on them. And seeing it then and there again, pitiful and wretched, made my chest tighten and my stomach churn. "Mom!" I screamed instinctively, like I was a kid again, and waking from a nightmare. A single, ear-shattering wail came from the house. All of us turned to see. Dan, Father, and me. Pressed on the spherical window made of plastic was Mother. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't look at her, truly. So finally looked away, and ran until I reached the cave where I had found Junior previously. Before I entered, I realized that night had fallen, and the hillside was finally in darkness. I looked up and saw the deepest blue sky one can imagine. It was terrible. I crawled back into the cave, and Junior was there waiting for me. And I haven't been back on the homestead until I heard your ship landing on the other side of the mountain. That was my story, Builder. By the way you're looking at me, I can tell you don't believe me. Or is it that I fill you with a sense of dread and disgust? That's alright. Besides, I couldn't believe what was happening either, as it was happening. I still don't know what I believe. I'm not an educated sort like you. I don't have explanations. If there is anything my small mind can understand, it's that the second son must have been something like me. And you. Something that could look down and feel scared or disgusted? I'm not sure. I just know that when the cosmic eye blinks again, it will all start over. God? Whatever I'm saying must be madness, because whatever is happening here must be madness as well. But it's true, all of it, and it will happen to you. We never had the colonists that came in the primary arc to welcome us and tell us what happened. Abandoned research facilities, half-built homesteads, and a deteriorating water filtration system. No electric grid, nothing. What was left of them were only things. There were no people, no animals either. No one to prepare us for this desolate planet and its strange cosmic disposition. I suspect Father and Dan might have come across the bones of the first colonists that arrived, and simply decided to never share that with me or the rest of the kids. The little thing I met in the caves, Junior, my supposed brother, told me everything I had just relayed to you. He was the one that reminded me about how we had arrived, where I was born, where he was born as well. He gifted me my memory back. Not many like him are on this planet, he said. No one left like me either. Mother and father are gone. And so is everyone else. I think that answers your questions about where everybody went and what happened on Nea Gaia. Let me go now, please, so I can return to the cabin and tend to Junior. I can hear him calling. Hey Creepypasta fans, it's Kira Rhodes. Thank you for listening to us and supporting us at the Dark Cosmos. Myself, Tiana Petkovska, one of our amazing writers, as well as our entire cast of voice actors, including Thomas Barker, Joseph Griffiths, and Teresa Appel, secretly put together this video as a thank you to you all for sticking by us and our channel, and especially as a thank you to our director and fellow voice actor, Kian Conception. We really appreciate all the time and effort he puts into this channel to make it what it is, and we are so proud to be a part of this journey with him. Thank you all again. If you'd like to connect with or support us, you can find our Discord and Patreon links in the description below. This has been the TDC crew, reminding you to stay cosmic.